Assalamu alaikum, Raza uncle.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you for joining us today. So just to start things off, why don't you give us a little background about where you came from and where your childhood was and what you did back home.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I was born in a small town called BUKOBA in Tanzania. And at the age of about 3, I moved to Dar es Salaam. And Dar es Salaam is where I pretty much grew up. My childhood was in Dar es Salaam until the age of 20. And I finished my high school over there before I moved out.
So while you were in Dar es Salaam, did you partake in the community?
Yeah, so my first interaction with community or serving the community was when I was a teenager. So I used to be volunteer in Muharram and Ramadan. So in Muharram specifically, I was part of a group that used to organize julus. I remember we were under a gentleman by the name of Babu Bhai Patel. And we used to, during these months of 12 days, or the first few nights of 12 days, we used to gather in Mifl-e-Asghari, the old Mifl-e-Asghari, and prepare all the julus and everything for the 10th night procession, which, as you know, is pretty big in Dar es Salaam. So that was my interaction over there in terms of community service. And then I would also volunteer during Ramadan, specifically during iftar. So I used to serve tea and water. So that was my pretty much first opportunity to serve the community.
So essentially, you were first a volunteer before you actually took up any positions later on in life.
Yeah, volunteering was what I actually wanted. I don't think at that time I even thought I would take any position. Taking up a position came much, much later in my life. But mainly was volunteering. I had learned from my father, who used to be secretary of BUKOBA Jamaat for many years, over 10, 15 years, about the importance of serving the community and the reward that you get for doing it. And I also had a personal reason of giving back to the community, which made me compelled to get into it and see how I can best serve the community.
So if you don't mind sharing, I mean, it's up to you, but if you don't mind sharing, what personal reason sort of motivated you to help or at least serve the community in general?
So I don't think I've mentioned this publicly before, although some people may know, but there was major setback that had happened to me personally in my life, and I came out of it. And that kind of made me want to do something because of that. At the age of 1.5-year-old, I was diagnosed with polio.
Oh, wow.
And pretty much from my neck down was totally paralyzed. And this was when I was still in BUKOBA. And I was taken to Uganda for trying to see what they can do. And I remember, this is the stories that I was being told by my parents and my uncles and people, community people in BUKOBA, who until today remember my childhood, because it was a very unique case at that time that had never happened in BUKOBA. So I was taken to Uganda, and I was pretty much given few weeks to survive. And there was nothing that they could have done other than trying to see whatever they can do, physiotherapy, things like that. But I managed to improve slowly. And then I was, my parents, or my mom specifically, who was with me throughout this ordeal, was told that, I may survive, but I will be disabled for the rest of my life, and probably my life expectancy would be about 10 to 12 years. So this whole ordeal took about a year and a half. So at the age of 1.5 to about 2.5, 3 years old, I went through this, and I remember my family, my uncles and them telling me how much my mom sacrificed, and so did my dad, because my dad had to stay back in BUKOBA for the rest of the family, and my mom was with me throughout this whole time, and then I had my other relatives too. But alhamdulillah, I was 100% recovered. The doctors at that time in Uganda, it was there were some very well-known doctors who had come at that time, and they themselves could not believe that that I recovered. I remember a lot of people who came to see me until today remember that there was a big sign in the hospital when you enter that said that there is a young boy who's suffering, the entire body, suffering from polio, and if you could pray for him. So I genuinely believe in prayers. I always tell people, if you are sick or you're ill, don't feel bad. I mean, don't keep it to yourself. Tell people to pray for you, because you don't know whose prayers are gonna be accepted. And I am a living miracle for that. So that kind of motivated me to, at some point, give back to the community, be a volunteer, because I have never forgotten that part of what I went through, even though I don't remember, because I was very young. But I have pictures, and I have so many people have told me about this, that I can literally write a book now. So that was one of the motivation. Obviously, my dad being in the community for that long, serving in the community for that long also was a motivation for me. My brother, my sister, everybody has in somewhere been part of the community in some capacity. So it's always good to do something for the community. However, I never at that time thought that I would take a position. Volunteering was about all I could think about at that time.
That's quite a story.
Yeah, I haven't told anyone so far, so I guess it's public now.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I was very hesitant to even talk about it, but I hope it motivates somebody. It gives an inspiration to somebody that, never lose hope. Never lose hope in the Almighty Allah. You never know whose prayer can be answered. You never know what kind of miracle can happen. And like I said, I'm a living miracle. I was not supposed to be here, let alone sitting with you at this time. I was supposed to be dead, 3-4 decades ago. I was then given 10 years, 12 years, disabled. And trust me, I'm not disabled. I've climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, so I know I'm not disabled. And but alhamdulillah, it's truly a miracle.
I wouldn't put it any short of anything less than a miracle.
Absolutely.
I think you've highlighted a few very important things. Primarily the fact that you had or faced an adverse situation, and you attributed coming out of it to a lot of different factors. I think a lot of people don't realize the different dynamics that come into play that lead to the success of an individual, whether it comes from family or from friends or from yourself, because you would have to have some sort of zeal or motivation to do something. And to top it all off, you also need prayers, like you mentioned.
Absolutely. Prayers is a big thing, and that's why, every time somebody is suffering from something, I always tell them, just go out there and tell people to pray for you. I have seen people who are sick who try to keep it to themselves, and I always tell them don't, because there is somebody out there who's going to pray for you, and you never know whose prayer are going to be accepted. And this is one of the main reasons that I spoke about this, because if my life story can inspire somebody, or if somebody is suffering and feel like they have no hope, then you just need to look at me. I came out of this, and if I can come out of this, anybody can come out of this. So prayers, that's all it's needed.
I think it's great to highlight the fact that even though this is supposed to be about community service, there's a lot more, again, that goes into play, and how our belief system actually strengthens our work ethic and the things that we do in general. So moving on, you mentioned that you were in Dar till about the end of high school?
Yes.
So what transpired after that?
So once I finished high school, I was quite motivated to go for further studies. And at that time, doing further studies in Dar es Salaam the options were very limited. It's not like right now. The options were very limited at that time. And I had my mom's family in Toronto, and they were very supportive of getting me over there. So I applied to some of the colleges, and I was accepted. And that made me migrate to Toronto for further studies. It was not easy. I have to tell you, first 3-4 months were very difficult. In fact, first 6 months was very difficult. Initially, I was homesick, and then the winter of Toronto hit me. So I had never experienced winter before in my life. And it was hard. But I remember one of my uncles that told me that if you can survive here for 1 year, you will never look back. And trust me, I never looked back after 1 year. So it was a true thing that he told me, that if I can hang on to this life for 1 year, things will work out by itself, and that's exactly what happened.
So you went to study in Toronto, and what happened after that?
So after I graduated in Toronto, I did my further studies in New York, and I also got my first job in New York. At the time when I graduated in Toronto, Toronto was going through recession. So it was very difficult getting a job in Toronto. And New York was quite attractive at that time. Few of my friends were in New York, and they convinced me to come at least take a look at it. So I had an opportunity to go to New York at that time. I used to go to New York quite a bit because I was involved playing volleyball. And at that time, we used to travel every Easter to New York for New York tournament. So when I went to New York, I liked it, and I thought that there is quite a good opportunity over here if I can get a job. And I did get a job, and I moved to New York. Once then that was the end of me living in Toronto, pretty much, and started my life in New York.
So what was your experience like in New York, and how were you involved in the community there?
So New York is where I first had my close interaction with the community. In a sense that in Toronto, my community involvement was very limited to volleyball, and that's about it, because my studies and then working after that gave me very little time to be part of any kind of community. But in New York, it kind of gave me, because New York is where I learned that mosque is not just a religious center, it's a social center too. And that's where, the interaction happens, that's where networking happens. So that's where I learned about how to mingle in a community, how to exchange ideas, learn about people, have Raza. I learned in New York. My involvement in New York, I wasn't involved in a community at the Jamaat level, but I was part of the volleyball team. And it was something that we used to look forward to every week. And that kind of gave me a platform of being known by other people, because in Toronto, not many people knew me because I barely went to the center. But in New York, quite a bit of people came to know me because either through they had interacted with me at the volleyball court or in the mosque. So aside from playing volleyball, I also just before I moved out of New York, that last year I served as a member of the managing committee of New York Union as well. So that was pretty much the closest interaction I had at a community level, other than making a point to attend all the programs and interacting with people and so on and so forth. So that was pretty much my interaction, and I was there for about 4 years or so before I migrated to Orlando.
Okay, so you went from Dar to Toronto to study, and then Toronto to New York for work. So what brought you to Orlando?
Weather. I remember it was back in '97 February. It was Ramadan, and Maulana Muhammad Naqvi, Sayyid Muhammad Naqvi, had come to New York to recite, and as friends we had decided we're going to go to Orlando after Ramadan and take him with us. And I had never been to Florida, so I decided, it would be nice to see a different place for a change. Now, February in New York is the peak winter, and the day we were leaving, there was a storm. So we flew to Daytona Beach, and when we came to Daytona Beach, that was the weekend of Daytona 500. And as soon as when we landed, we cleared all the airport and everything, gates, and as soon as I walked out, I saw two things. First was warm and sunny in February, and second was palm trees. And I decided this is the place I want to be. So that was my first interaction about Orlando. And then, we came over here, we looked at the places. Now, living in New York and living in Florida is quite a bit of different. There's more time in hand over here. Things are quite spread out. It's not like New York, everything is congested. Traffic, at least at that time, wasn't as bad. So, and obviously the weather was a big factor. And then a lot of people in New York at that time had decided or contemplating to move to Orlando. So I felt like it would be something if I could figure out a way to get a job over here and move. Now the easier part about moving was I was engaged, I was not married. So it was an easy decision to make because I didn't have to ask permission to move. But because I remember when at that time, my fiance, who is now my wife, when I called her and I told her that I'm thinking about moving to Orlando, I don't think she could tell the difference between New York or Orlando because she had never been to either places. So she was like, she was like, whatever works for you, I'm good with it. It was a few years later when I took her to New York that she told me this was the best decision I ever made. So, at that time, many of my friends were also moving to Orlando, and collectively we all kind of thought that, let's go over there, let's see what happens. And for me, the decision was very simple because, first of all, I was alone. And second was, it was all dependent on if I get a good job. And at that time, there was not much thinking. When you are alone, you don't think too much or don't think too through. So, I made a decision I want to move, and here I am.